Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's C2 Akeneo webinar on executing a virtual PIM platform kickoff. My name is Dave Clark. I'll be your host today. Before we get started, just a few notes to start us off. I want you to know that this will be a very interactive webinar today. We'll have a live audience Q&A session at the end of today's discussion. And if you have any questions at all, you can type them at any time into the Q&A box that you'll find on your screen. We're interested today in all of your questions. We want to hear from you, so get all of those questions into the Q&A box. We'll try to answer as many of them today as we can. Also, if your question is specific to one particular person, be sure to indicate that person's name in your question. You can also use that Q&A box that I mentioned to communicate with me if you're having any technical problems during the webinar today. I think you'll be perfectly fine, but if anything comes up, if you have any problem at all, just let me know what the specific problem is, and I'll provide some help. All right, I think that's everything you need to know for today. So let's get started with today's webinar on executing a virtual PIM platform kickoff. And let's begin by meeting today's speakers. Matt Spangler is Vice President of Pricing and Product Data at the Granite Group. Matt has worked for 20+ years in wholesale distribution with the Granite Group, where he manages strategic direction of the company's pricing and product data for 40+ brick and mortar locations, as well as their e-commerce platform. Brad Johnson is a functional consultant at Akeneo. Brad was one of the first Akeneo functional consultants in the US, and he spent the last 5+ years working with customers across a wide variety of industries as both a DAM and PIM expert. Jonathan Curry is Manager of Data Services and PIM Practice at C2. Jonathan has been with C2 for 8 years and in technology consulting for 15 years, and he currently leads C2's PIM delivery practice. And finally, Tom Williams is Vice President of e-business at C2. Tom leverages 20+ years of business experience across technology, platform, and services companies, digital marketing, and strategic consulting to drive successful outcomes for customers. He brings a unique blend of business strategy, financial acumen, and technical competency to all of his consulting engagements. And Tom is also going to serve as our webinar moderator today, and I think we're ready to get started. So I'm going to turn things over to you now, Tom. Take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dave. Really appreciate that. And welcome everyone to this webinar. Really excited to have everyone join us. Really kind of the impetus behind this webinar is as everyone is dealing with mandatory work from home and remote orders coming from everywhere from the heads of your companies to our governments. How do we basically keep business going, keep the economy spinning? And we had something pretty cool happen on our side, and we wanted to basically share all that with you. So kind of going through real quick, who the players are on the call. So we have the Granite Group as our highlighted customer here. The Granite Group, based in Concord, New Hampshire, ranked as one of the top 40 plumbing, heating, and PVF wholesale distributors in the United States. They serve all of New England with plumbing, heating, cooling, water, and propane supplies. C2 provides IT consulting services, including digital transformation strategy, PIM and MDM, e-commerce, cloud, and managed services that drive competitive advantage. And Akeneo. Akeneo is a global leader in product experience management solutions that help merchants and brands deliver a compelling customer experience across all sales channels, including e-commerce, mobile, print, and retail points of sale. So to kind of put all these three together for you just real quickly, this all has to do with kicking off a large-scale technology product, which is the Akeneo PIM platform, with C2, who is a systems integrator implementer for the Granite Group. As we kind of go through the agenda real quick, we're going to talk about the events that led up to a full remote kickoff. Literally, this was a 2.5-day kickoff that found itself moving into a remote scenario very quickly. How we retooled for a virtual kickoff and some of the technologies that we use to find success. And then finally, we'll finish off with a results and lessons learned and some key takeaways. Our hope for this is, regardless of who you are, where you're at, in business, organization, association, whatever it is, that this is helpful to you as you move forward, needing to do similar things with both your employees as well as your customers. So with that, we'll get right into, the events that led up to the kickoff. So I'll just run through this real quick, and then we'll start bringing our panelists in for some color on this. Just, how fast everything changed on our side. So, interestingly, Thursday, March 12th, around 2 p.m., we confirmed the on-site kickoff. We actually made dinner reservations in Concord, New Hampshire, and prepared ourselves for the in-person kickoff, and that was between ourselves and the Granite Group and Akeneo. We were all on board for our typical in-person meetings. 24 hours later, by Friday, March 13th at 2 p.m., C2 and Akeneo were having an emergency meeting to discuss moving the whole thing into a remote session and what this would mean, and also how we would message this to Matt over at the Granite Group. During our phone call around 2:30, Matt called in on my other ear and said, I really think we need to make this thing go remote. So what was really cool about this whole thing is no one ever said, hey, let's hit the brakes. Let's pause the project. Let's just stop and see, what happens here. That was never even under consideration. Immediately, all three parties moved into, how do we keep this going? How do we keep the traction? How do we keep the project on track? And how do we do this virtual? The following Tuesday at 9 a.m., the virtual session began. So I want to bring Brad in first up with Akeneo. So Akeneo has its headquarters actually in Nantes, France. And so Brad was actually kind of the unique position, since France was sort of several weeks ahead as Europe was hit before the US, and receiving, information out of the French office around things they were doing. And I just wanted to ask Brad, what types of information was your European headquarters sort of pushing to you guys, and how are you digesting that?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so one of the first things was that our France office actually implemented mandatory work from home about a week and a half or so before us. So about that time, we were instructed to start planning to do everything fully remote, which is something we're not used to. We do on-site kickoffs for all of our kickoffs and our workshops. And so essentially we moved into the planning phase. So we had to figure out, all of our on-site commitments, turning those into remote. And of course, first up for myself was Granite Group. So yeah, France had told us early on to start planning for this. And that's what we did as a team.
Excellent. I'm going to go to Jonathan now over at C2, who spearheads the PIM projects, especially at that critical kickoff and to get things rolling. Jonathan, how fast were things changing at C2 from your perspective?
Yeah, so from the C2 side, that Friday afternoon, we were all preparing to go totally remote the day before we had made the decision as a company to go work from home, and everyone was clearing off their desks, making sure they were connected and set up in their home offices. So that was at the same time we were making this decision, I was working on that process.
Excellent. Now I want to bring in Matt. So Matt, kind of in a unique position with the Granite Group, which obviously is a distribution company, meaning that product has to move. So, C2 as a services and knowledge company, we can flip to remote fairly easily, as can Akeneo. Matt, what was going on with the Granite Group, and how did you guys, kind of come to this tough decision?
Well, I think earlier that week, Tom, we had several members of our leadership team basically band together and become sort of a virus response team. And, essentially what they did was meet daily, and they continue to. And communicate, with all Granite Group employees as things were sort of changing and moving quickly. And basically, by that Friday morning, communication had gone out that we were not to have any meetings with more than 5 people present in the room. And that is what ultimately prompted the phone call to you to talk about moving this thing to a remote format. And I'll just add that as I was thinking about going in that direction, I said, I was very skeptical and said, I don't know that this is going to work. And then eventually, by the time I had called you, I had flipped the switch a little bit and said, we have to make this work.
Yeah, I think it was the same kind of thinking too on the C2 side, was around like, we don't really have other options if we're going to keep the project going. Not that we were excited about the idea of a remote kickoff, which had never been done before on our side, but that it was simply going to be a necessity. So let's shift a little bit into the retooling. So we've all sort of realized this is going to happen, and an in-person meeting obviously quite a bit different than a virtualized one. You know, doing a 1 hour virtualized session or meeting, everyone's pretty used to webinars such as the one we're doing today. When you put that in the context of 2.5 days of being remote and how do you keep people engaged and all these things, we had to take that pretty seriously. So I wanted to bring Jonathan back in from C2, because I know, Jonathan, you were on the phone with Brad and looking at, you know, what needs to happen from an agenda and schedule perspective to kind of retool this thing for a virtualized session. What did you guys do?
Sure. So with any project that we're doing at Kickoff, we want to make sure that we plan a detailed agenda. So we had our standard agenda that we went through, and we'd allocated all the different topics to their time slots. And in this case, we, you know, with the news of making it go virtual, we just took another look at the agenda. We shuffled some things around, and we tried to be very structured about set timeframes when we would do breaks and breaks for folks to check their email and, you know, catch up with other things. And we also tried to consider just the uniqueness of making sure we could capture folks' attention and trying to segment the agenda so that we could be productive with each of the working session topics and sprinkling in the breaks accordingly.
Excellent. And as you can tell, Jonathan has a very calm demeanor. One of the things we say at C2 is that Jonathan brings the calm in the midst of when projects are going crazy. It's very difficult to rattle Jonathan. Brad, you're a little bit more like me, as far as not necessarily being calm. What was going through your mind as you realized you guys have to retool this thing, and this is something that Akeneo had never done the same way C2's never done?
Yes, so you're right. I was a little nervous. So I'm used to, you know, I travel all around the country and I do these kickoffs in person. I mean, one of my lines is one of the benefits is getting everybody in a room. And there's typically, you know, a lot of whiteboarding and collaboration, and I was really worried about how we're going to handle that. So, you know, when you're presented with something like this, you just have to figure it out. So, you know, I made sure that my hardware was set up. I'm plugged into Ethernet. I have a good microphone. Since I was going to be running the whole thing, I wanted to make sure that my hardware and software was set up correctly. So I used Zoom. And with our type of work, which is product data, luckily we can use Excel a bunch. So in days 2 and 3 of the workshop, we did a lot of collaboration in Excel, where Jonathan was sharing a lot, and we would talk through some of the data. So really it was a matter of making sure that the right tools were set up. And like Jonathan said, having a really structured agenda with lots of breaks built in. And then of course, I think a big thing is up top, just kind of set the tone. You know, we're all in this kind of weird predicament together. So if you need anything at all, just speak up, and just have it very open and informal, yet structured with the time.
Excellent. That's a great lead in to bring Matt in, because I've always regarded Matt as the start on time, stop on time guy. He has a real a talent for that and keeping things, you know, structured, focused. But Matt, you had the largest challenge. You had the largest group of people. You had some people that you had to sort of disperse in a large conference room that we want to hear more about, and you had others working remote from houses. how did you wrangle all this and talk about the importance of the time starting and stopping?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's Jonathan touched on it, and so did Brad. The agenda was set up in such a way where it was very structured, very focused, while also allowing us to sort of decompress every hour and a half or so, which was great. In terms of how we handled it, we weren't fully remote. Actually, as of today, it's still an option to go into work. So we had some team members that were self-quarantined and who joined us remotely. And then we had a small core of people that met in our conference room. And the technology we used was a Cisco conference phone, essentially, that has a couple of attachments with remote speakers and mute buttons. And then we just sort of projected Brad's presentation on the screen. So it was definitely challenging, but I think as everyone has said, we made it through successfully, got done what we needed to get done, and part of that I think was just being super disciplined throughout the entire 2.5 days.
Excellent. So just to recap, some of the hardware, and software tools that were used, Zoom conference, which is what we're using for this webinar, sharing, obviously, PowerPoint, Excel for data dumps. The one piece that obviously was missing was the whiteboarding. So very typical, trying to explain something, especially if you get into complex taxonomy or data modeling or something, to pop up and just start scratching things out on a whiteboard. Jonathan, you are definitely a whiteboard kind of guy. Did you see this as a significant hindrance to you, or did you were you able to just move forward without it easily?
Well, in this case, we did lighten up a little bit on our discussion on the business process and the workflow, which again is in terms of PIM design and modeling is the piece that requires the most whiteboarding. We do have other tools like Lucidchart that we use to facilitate those discussions remotely. In this case, we really wanted to focus in on the foundation of the data model, and Akeneo is very structured, and they provide all the templates that you need to do that data modeling. So that's what we really focused on in this case. So I thought that worked quite well.
Excellent. And I do want to note that, in the agenda, so people could see this, we specifically called out not just a break, but the kind of break. So we were, laughing earlier that if you're in person and you need a bio break, everyone kind of agrees, okay, let's take a bio break. We'll take 10. Everyone leaves the conference room, gets a drink of water, things like this. You don't typically interrupt a webinar and say, hey, everyone, I have to go pee. Can we take a bio break? So we made sure that we were explicitly putting that into the agenda, that these breaks are set for, getting up, leaving your desk. And then we would say, okay, make sure everyone is back in exactly 15 minutes. And Matt, as you can attest, at the 15-minute mark, people were there, checked in, and we went forward, correct?
Yeah, it was great. Everybody on all three teams committed to those breaks and being back on time. As we talked earlier, when you're not in the same room and somebody's not back on the call, you can't just go run down the hall and say, where's Jonathan? So, which can be frustrating, but everybody committed to the breaks and the timing, and we were all present when we were supposed to be throughout the 2.5 days. Excellent.
So Brad, you've got a little bit of a unique situation in that you actually work from a home office quite frequently. And one thing that a lot of people haven't thought about, everyone's like, oh yeah, Zoom and screen share, and I can share my screen and all these things. But a lot of people haven't really thought through taking some of the other variabilities out, such as the ability for your computer to connect across the Wi-Fi into a router, plugged into a modem, and having a good audio experience since you're not talking across the table at people. Can you share with everyone real quick just a little bit about the setup that you've got there?
Yes, of course. So I use, when I'm at home, I use my desktop computer, and I have that plugged in to the Ethernet. If if possible, plug into your Ethernet. It's usually you have a plug in the back of the router. Get a really long Ethernet cord if you can. And then also, if you don't have Ethernet capabilities, then just try to be as near to your router as you can be. That's probably the most important. And secondly, I would say just to have good audio. I have kind of a more professional kind of setup with an XLR mic, but you don't need that. Really just a USB microphone and headphones is really all you need for that when it comes to kind of presenting. And then Zoom, like you said, which I think is kind of, the de facto best conferencing software, but making sure you're hardwired if you can be, very close to your router if you cannot be, and a decent mic. Basically anything but your computer audio for audio.
Excellent. And by plugging into the router itself using an RJ45 Ethernet cable, you're really taking the wireless sort of noise or disruption. You're taking that variable out by like hardwiring directly to the router, which should be hardwired into the modem, or perhaps some routers and modems are actually one unit and then going out through cable or whatever other method is going out. So you're really taking the wireless sort of factor and risk off, right?
Exactly. It's just a way kind of, if you think of it, it's just way more secure in that you're not going to get dropped packets and things like that. Yep, absolutely.
And if you're in a position where you do need to be connected wirelessly, a lot of routers have multiple settings. They usually will have a faster setting around, like a 5G setting, and a setting that's not as fast, usually a 2.4G setting. The difference being that the 2.4 slower setting gives greater range. So if you're quite a ways away from the router, you probably don't want to be on the 5G. You may get better signal reception to that router if you're using the 2.4. So all these things that we're now, a lot of people don't even know about, and with some of their home hardware are coming into consideration.
Yep, absolutely. And one last thing that we did in the very beginning, at least, Jonathan and I turned on our camera to say, hey, this is what we look like. This is who we are, just for a minute or two, just to get everybody to put a face to the name and the voice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be really important. And one of the things we talked about was, going virtual, what you lose is you lose the human element, and you lose the body language, and those types of things. So
right.
If you're in a place where you can actually turn on the camera without it turning into a disruption,
right.
That can also be a good thing. All right, so we're going to move over to the results and lessons learned section. So the good news on this, if you haven't picked up on it yet, is that even though there was a lot of nervousness sort of going into a 2.5-day virtual kickoff with over a dozen people from remote locations, we found success. And again, that's one of the reasons that we wanted to get everyone on the line and say, hey, you don't have to 2-foot the brakes on your business and your customers and the economy. You can find success using the tools that are available to us. So Matt, I mean, as our mutual customer, your opinion of success and failure is actually the one that matters. So just to kind of bring you back in, what was your opinion?
I think we absolutely succeeded in accomplishing what we set out to do. In fact, based on Brad's feedback, I think we actually got more. We were actually ahead of the pace that we, were trying to accomplish over the 2.5 days. I think there was a lot that went into that success. I think, if you've read, The Lord of the Flies, respecting the conch is probably the biggest one, and really just trying to listen, become a really good listener, because when you don't have all these people in the room, you can't see visual clues as to when they're starting and stopping and want to speak. And I think we had a few moments over the 2.5 days where the conversations got messy, but for the most part they didn't. And I would say to both Brad, Jonathan, as well, that as leaders of the respective teams, when those conversations got messy, I think we all did a good job putting the brakes on, resetting, and essentially just, getting back to one voice and making sure that we were all on the same page.
So kind of springboarding on that, I'm not going to let you off the hook yet. There was sort of an unexpected benefit that we all agreed was there around kind of like an increased focus, and not like getting caught up in some sidebar conversations and things that can happen in-person meetings. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I certainly can. I think when you do these remote sessions, one thing you should probably shoot for is the same, if not more, output, but far less input. And what I mean when I say that is essentially what you just referred to. I think the focus is so strong, and because you're not in the same room, there are not sidebar conversations. I think you eliminate, unfortunately, some of the relationship building stuff, but you eliminate a lot of noise and extraneous conversation. And I think that actually allowed us to move the project forward faster than I would have anticipated.
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting one that I don't think any of us anticipated happening. So Jonathan, first time that C2 has done a multi-day kickoff in a remote setting. Were you surprised at how things went?
Once we kind of kicked off the sessions and looked at both the preparation material that the Granite Group had provided in terms of data samples, as well as, like I said before, the Akeneo templates that are very structured. I wasn't actually as surprised as you might think that we were able to get as far. I think really a lot of that goes into providing structure and providing the artifacts that we need. And I think that sort of the third element, as Matt said, is all of the attendees really focusing on the most important pieces and eliminating, some of the extraneous discussion was actually very effective. So I was really happy that things came out the way they did, and that we're able to capture the outputs that we needed and the artifacts that we have, and we're able to kind of jumpstart the project.
Nice. So, again, kind of an interesting thing here is that, Brad and myself and Jonathan as consultants are quite used to hopping on planes to make these in-person kickoffs and things work. I know Brad has been back and forth before COVID, back and forth to California with a customer multiple times, back and forth to Boston, California, back and forth. And here, we had a situation where, the C2 headquarters is a couple hours drive from Concord, New Hampshire. Brad, I think you were looking forward to actually being able to commute back and forth to the kickoff, which is sort of unheard of. And yet we wound up doing everything totally remote. So also first time, that Akeneo has done something like this. How was the outcome from this whole thing different than what you were expecting going in?
Yeah, so I was pleasantly surprised. So to Matt's point, we got further than we typically do in one of these workshops. And also to his point, I think a lot of people lose focus and they're doing their emails when you're in person and you ask them a question and you have to repeat it. And none of that was happening because we're all very, very focused. And I think that, we were, so at the end of our workshops, typically, we haven't really gotten into a customer's data. We've kind of just introduced them to Akeneo and all of the features and concepts. But with Granite Group, we're already knee deep into their data. We've got a bunch of data models figured out. And I think that was due to the fact that we were able to just really zone in, everybody's staring at the screen and just hammering it out. It's tedious work, but everybody was super energized and really focused. And so like Matt said, and like I've said, I am super impressed with how far we already are with this project. And we just had a call yesterday and we're even, exponentially further than we were last week. So 2 thumbs up for me, and we're just moving really smoothly.
Good deal. So with that, I just want to kind of move into the key takeaways. And again, if you're able to join the webinar today, we always want to make sure that you're able to take some things away. We're all navigating this new world in real time. And so I think one of the things that we talked about was how critical the planning and scheduling is. So again, just kind of back to Matt with the start on time, stop on time, and the planning. Did you want to touch base on any of that, Matt?
I think that was the number one reason that we were successful. Besides the quality of the people involved, our respective teams, but the respect that everybody paid to that schedule, the amount of planning that went into it, literally just kept us on track for 2.5 days, where without that we could have meandered and had not such a great experience. So that's the number one thing as far as I would say, and everybody was very respectful of that schedule and being on time and stopping on time.
Excellent. And I know that we definitely, when we were retooling the schedule, we added some additional breaks. We tried to chunk the work into very defined buckets and put those breaks in. I would encourage everyone, as you're retooling for these marathon sessions, if you have some in front of you, insert the breaks and take the breaks. Sometimes there's a tendency for people to go, oh, let's just plow through this break and we can get done 15 minutes earlier. Not bad, but at the same time, in 20 minutes, that same person needs to use the restroom. Like I said, they're not going to announce it. They're just going to walk away from their desk, possibly miss some important information, and go take the bio break anyway. So it's best to coordinate all those breaks, have frequent smaller breaks kind of throughout the day, get up from your desk and kind of get your head back in order. Obviously, using good webinar tool. We're not endorsing Zoom, but it seems to be a very good tool that a lot of people are using. Brad had talked about before, thinking through your hardware, trying to plug into your router or modem. It gets rid of that Wi-Fi point of failure. Getting a good headset. I will tell you that I have a better headset on order right now, as I'm doing all of my calls remotely at this point. The audio quality definitely matters. And certainly if you can, flipping on the camera and being able to have a little bit of face-to-face, even in a 2-dimensional view versus a full 3-dimensional, even if it's just at the beginning, kind of a virtual face-to-face handshake, if you will, can be helpful. So with that, any final thoughts from the panelists before we move to Q&A? All right. So Dave, I'm going to pass it back to you to kind of guide us through some of the Q&A here.
Great, thanks so much, Tom. So as we transition to the Q&A segment of today's webinar, it's looking like a few of you have already submitted questions. Thank you very much for those. If you have a question that you haven't submitted, all you have to do is open up the Q&A box and type it in there. And again, if your question is specific to one particular person, it would be really helpful if you could indicate that person's name in your question. So we have plenty of time for Q&A. Let's jump right into it. Let's go first to this question from Max. And Matt, it looks like this one's for you. Of course, the rest of you, feel free to jump in as well. The question is, if you could do the kickoff over again, would you do it any differently?
That's a tough question. I've thought about that, and hindsight's 2020. The one thing that we did struggle with from a technology standpoint, and again, hats off to Brad for his setup. We never lost connectivity. We did have some sound issues on our end, meaning volume issues, hearing some of the people that were on the call. So I think, the approach of having, 3 or 4 of us in a room was good in some ways, because, the Granite team could kind of take, see visual clues as to what, the other people were doing. But honestly, I think if I had to do it again, I might say everyone should have been at their laptop with a headset just to overcome those sound issues.
Great, thanks, Matt. Let's go next to this question from Tracy. And Jonathan, it looks like this one is for you. Michael, Tom, feel free to jump in as well. The question is, in addition to project management and execution, how do you maintain team member engagement with the distributed delivery model at C2?
Sure. So one of the things we really pride ourselves on at C2 is our culture and our connection. And I think that really helps us in the quality of our delivery. So with this remote delivery model, we do have to take some extra time to make sure that we connect with our team members one-on-one, reviewing both the project delivery, but also just checking in with them and making sure that, having the same conversation that you would passing by them in the hallway, just to make sure that we're maintaining that connection with folks and sort of keeping up the personal relationships.
Great. Tom, did you want to contribute anything to that?
No, that was really good. I would say we kind of went past one of the sort of like the ongoing tool sets that we use. So at C2, we use Microsoft Teams. We have in the past, typically in like project by project settings, with what's going on right now in the world, Teams has become a real critical part for the whole company to communicate. It is the tool that kind of on an ongoing basis we're working with Akeneo and the Granite Group on as well. And we're using some of the tools inside there, like Planner, which lets us put finite tasks onto cards in kind of a Kanban style and move those along. And being able to just quickly, used to just pop your head in someone's office and ask the quick question. Can't do that anymore, but you can with like a Teams chat. So it's almost like the IM chat function on Teams is kind of the replace the Office pop-in, if you will. And then of course, the standard things about scheduling meetings and things with people. But yeah, it's been great to see both the internal team and also, just really embrace that technology and stay more closely connected.
Great, thanks, Tom. So let's go to this question. This one's from Michael. And Brad, it's for you. The question is, what's the most important thing to remember to ensure a smooth remote implementation? I know, Brad, you had a lot of good tips regarding technology. What else can you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's to have a plan, but be ready to move away from it. So, we've talked about how structured everything was, and it was, but we still gave ourselves enough room to be flexible. I think with all of this, I think that's going to be the most important things for people to be flexible. So structured yet flexible.
Here's a really great question. I'm just going to throw this out to all of you. The question is from Phyllis, and it's, do you think all of this will change your long-term strategy on project kickoff calls? The fact that you can make them more remote, and maybe that means they'll be less costly to the client. What do you think?
So from my perspective, not so much. So I still value the in-person workshop very much, because to me, it's about getting a bunch of people in a room that typically aren't in a room together, and lots of stuff gets hashed out. And then again, that whiteboarding piece is really crucial for us. So for myself, I would say I would still rather do in person, but it's awesome to know that, with where we are in 2020, everybody's kind of set up and ready to go remote if need be.
So I'm curious as to Matt's response on this, because for those of you who don't know how consulting contracts typically work, the client will pick up the tab for the T&E, the expenses, the travel, airfare, hotels, those types of things. So so there was definitely a reduction in initial expense. Matt, is this something that for future other implementations you're starting to kind of toy around in your head with?
Well, I have to say I wouldn't rule it out for sure. I do agree with Brad, and I think the relationship building is important when you're working with multiple teams consisting of multiple people, because of the results and that cost. I mean, I'm not going to say no to cost savings, right? I mean, that's that's extremely beneficial. So for me, it's almost like you just have to weigh, essentially your trust, or maybe your relationship that you already have with your respective partners. And if it's built up to a certain level, you could probably be very comfortable doing this remotely and sacrifice that in person. But if you haven't built up that trust, you know, the on-site would definitely be the way to go.
Yeah, and you know, for us, and I think for C2 as well, like one of the things we'll do is take the customer out to dinner, right? And that's a really great thing for us to, like Matt said, really build that relationship, and just become, you know, more trustworthy to our customers.
Absolutely, and we have an understanding that the kickoff dinner isn't canceled. It's simply postponed to either a mid project high five or a celebration dinner, but definitely still on the calendar.
Hey Tom, I'd also say that, I mean, the Granite Group, you know, we're all about relationships with our customers and our vendors, and I think we've had this conversation before. You know, and literally before we signed on with C2 and Akeneo, I got to spend a decent amount of time, a lot of time on the phone with a lot of Akeneo folks. I got to spend some time with Tom in person, as well as you know, Akeneo came on site a couple of times. So, and I actually went to their office for a visit. So we did have that advantage where, like, literally the only person that I hadn't interacted with much was Brad, and based on my experience with everyone else at Akeneo, I was very confident that that Brad would be very good at what he does, which apparently he is. So,
Thanks,
yeah, that
Matt.
is very true. There certainly was a decent amount of in-person and relationship building that happened, you know, leading up to the kickoff itself. I wonder if things would have been different without sort of those in-person relationships already established.
Some great insight there. Thanks, gentlemen. Let's bounce back to Matt now. Another question for you, Matt. This one's from George. This is a really interesting question. Did you do anything virtually to try to build relationships and trust?
I don't think we did. We did the normal round of introductions, you know, which are obligatory when you're doing these things. You know, with a short introduction of who we are and what we do, what our roles are. Outside of that, I mean, we didn't do any like ice breaking activities or team building activities. I think, as I mentioned, we really didn't need that as much because I was very familiar and comfortable with Tom and Jonathan and Akeneo as a company. So we just kind of jumped right into it, and I think, you know, it's interesting when you talk about this in-person versus remote and relationship building. You can build relationships remotely. You know, I've never met Jonathan. I hopefully will someday, but I do feel like, you know, Jonathan and I have a sort of rapport at this point, having worked on this for a couple of weeks, and hopefully he agrees. But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I think it actually sort of happened organically throughout the 2.5 days.
Yep. And with this particular instance, we had, I don't know if you remember back, but we had, you know, a 2.5 day turnaround time. So there wasn't much time for virtual get to know yous.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, though, and you're right, Brad. I was going to say the same thing. Like, you know, the speed with which we retooled this thing was just mind blowing. But now, kind of looking at it on the long horizon, as far as like doing this again, depending on how long we're sort of in this situation, there are a lot of, you know, very creative virtual icebreaker things. And it's funny, I actually think about like my kids, right? Like when I was little and you wanted to play with your friends, you'd get on your bike, you'd go to their house, you'd be running around in the backyard. And nowadays, most of the kids join up virtually, playing Fortnite online together, and are actually in remote locations. So the young generation is, you know, being remote and building remote relationships is second nature, maybe first nature for them, and for us who didn't grow up with like that. It's, you know, we're trying to tool ourselves back in. Not that we should all jump on Fortnite and have some team building, although I might be up for that. But I'm sure that there are dozens and dozens of interesting and very interactive online icebreaker, get to know you relationship building tools that are available that should probably be thought through very carefully for future kickoffs like this.
Still have plenty of time left for Q&A, so if you'd like to pick the brains of our team here, please get those questions in. Let's go next to this question from Stuart, and I think, Brad, this one is for you. How can you ensure your PIM and product enrichment flow continues to run smoothly while employees work remotely?
Oh boy, that's a that's a kind of a heavy one. No, so fortunately, Akeneo is kind of built for collaboration. You know, if you have a well-structured PIM, folks should be able to do their normal day-to-day work remotely without missing a beat. That's kind of the beauty of the PIM and how we set it up with the workflows and things like that. So with that, you know, communication, I would say, is key. Just make sure that everybody's communicating together around, you know, product lifecycle. But like I said, I think that just kind of inherently, Akeneo is really well structured for people working remotely and enriching products in that way.
All right, looks like we're down to our last question here, but we still have plenty of time left, so get those questions in. You can still do that at the last minute here. This one is from Carla, and I'm just going to throw this one out to the C2 folks. The question is, how are you building redundancy into your teams for project continuity in case of project disruption due to key people becoming ill? It's a really good question.
Sure, so I can take a crack at this one and Tom chime in as well. From our side, we want to make sure that we're managing through the tools that we have. So we mentioned Microsoft Teams, Planner, and our team members are familiar with all of the activities. And you know, we have both a functional lead and a technical lead on each project. And we're well versed in covering for each other in the event of vacations or illness or anything that happens during the course of a project. But again, I really making sure that we're structured with our process and with our tools so that everybody knows what's going on at all time and we're totally transparent.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, something that I've always felt the C2 does particularly well. That's kind of a, you know, pain in the neck, but best practice is really around documentation. And so, like Jonathan said, it's not unusual for a consultant to execute a project, move on to another project, and then the customer would like to do, you know, a second phase or need some help. The first consultant may not be available. It's really, you know, that documentation that you can go back through and very quickly come up to speed on exactly, you know, everything that's been done, how it's put together, all those things. And that's definitely a core strength of C2 is having good documentation. And there's kind of a, you know, an unwritten rule that do your documentation well, because, you know, you might be the one receiving someone else's documentation. You may be the consultant called upon to jump in. And if you want good documentation, you need to be producing that good documentation as well.
All right, well, thanks for all of those great questions. If a question occurs to you later, feel free to get in touch. We have some email addresses up on the screen for you right now. Before we wrap things up today, Tom, Matt, Brad, Jonathan, any closing remarks?
This is Tom. I'll go first. And again, I just want to encourage everyone who has joined the webinar. You know, health and safety first, right? But second behind that, I think it's very important that we continue to keep things going, that we don't let you know, the COVID pandemic cause us to seize up and freeze us up. And I just you know, hope that this has been a positive webinar for folks, that you've picked up some kind of tools and tricks, and hopefully just some motivation that although the world is quite a bit different right now, you know, go forward.
Tom, I can expand on that a little bit from our perspective too. So being, you know, a brick and mortar company, this is a little bit more tricky for us to manage than it is, I would say, for a tech company or a software company. And as a team, same thing that you were just saying, you know, despite everything that's going on, we've been able to keep, you know, our brick and mortar locations open and safe through different precautions. And I'll also just say this, because this was really, I think, a really cool moment for us as a company. Yesterday, we were talking about this. So if you were to ask most of us what we do for a living. Our quick answer would be we sell toilets, which doesn't sound, all that important, but we're on that list of essential businesses, which is pretty cool. Like, people need hot water, right? They need heat and they need cooling. So for us, it's very validating that we are sort of essential, in this world, and our intention is just to keep going throughout all of this.
Okay, well, a big thanks to all of our speakers today, Matt Spangler, Brad Johnson, Jonathan Curry, and Tom Williams, for all of their insights into today's topic. We really appreciate it. Before we let you go, just a few final notes. Today's webinar was recorded, and you'll be receiving an email with a link to access that recording when it's available. So check your inboxes for that. Perhaps you'd like to view the webinar again, or maybe you missed something. So be on the lookout for that email. And that email will also include a link to a very brief survey that we hope you'll take. We'd really like to know your thoughts concerning today's webinar. We love to see feedback, so let us know what you thought. Please take a couple of moments to complete that survey if you could. We're going to give you a little bit of time back today. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being with us today. That does conclude today's webinar. Have a great day, everybody.